I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is, we were just talking about this. She works, she's writing a book on Git for O'Reilly called Git for Teams, and she's been teaching Git for over a decade. Please welcome Emma Jane Hogbin Westby.
Well done.
Thank you so much.
Alors, bonjour à tout le monde. Je peux parler un tout petit peu de français parce que je suis du Canada, mais malheureusement, je dois présenter en anglais. So, good morning, everyone. I am Canadian, not American. Yes! Therefore, I can speak a tiny little bit of French. I will gesture enthusiastically, wildly. I will speak way too quickly, and it is your job to make sure that I slow down to a manageable level. I am happy to take questions in French, but I probably should answer them in English to make sure that I have actually given you the right information. So here's the thing. My presentation is kind of a little bit weird. I'm a little bit nervous about it, to be honest. And I'm going to be talking more about adult education and learning styles and learning theories than I am going to be speaking about Git. So we'll see how this goes. But I think it'll be interesting. And as Scott mentioned, I've been teaching this for quite a long time. My first sort of introduction to teaching version control was to liberal arts students at a community college in Canada over a decade ago. And we used CVS. They didn't even know how to program. It was challenging, I think is the best way to say that. There were tears, there was swearing, but we got through it together. And then my first distributed version control system was Bazaar, and that my heart still, you never forget your first DVCS. So my heart still belongs to Bazaar, and I found the onboarding process very, very easy with Bazaar. When I came to Git, it was more of a challenge, so shall we say. Things were listed alphabetically instead of in order. It was confusing and complicated. And I sort of made it my life's mission to teach people who were in this trap that I had fallen into of really being frustrated and confused by the experience of version control. So the way that I now teach Git is very much in part based on the fact that most of my students come to me and they're already in this state. So they are not first-time version control users. They are people who have been demoralized, and they've become frustrated and angry, and they aren't really sure what happened to their precious, precious work, but they know it's not there anymore. And it's a little bit terrifying for them. So this is the starting place where I begin teaching version control for many of the workshops that I teach. And so I do it in a non-standard way as far as version control often gets taught. And it is difficult to learn. I mean, sort of at the age of 3 or 1 or 5, learning is still exciting. We think school is really cool. We wake up early on our first day of class. We've got our special outfit set aside. And we go to school excited to be poured with knowledge, and everything is exciting and charming. And then we get to be adults, and learning is now, it's a little bit terrifying. It's something that you're not sure if you're going to lose your job if you can't figure it out. It's something that you don't necessarily have things removed from your plate to be allowed to show up at a classroom and learn a new topic. Learning Git on top of that is especially difficult because it's not what we do, it supports what we do. At least for most people, it is a supporting character in our work. How many people here are Git developers? So not even a third of the audience. So 2/3 of you are in this similar kind of situation where Git isn't your main focus, although it may be the focus of most of your attention on some days. It's it's sort of, I guess, an unfortunate piece as well in that Git has, as a piece of software, still got these sort of leftover pieces of language in it. So if you do git help git, it's referring the man pages. I will refer to Git as an entity. I know it's kind of weird, but as far as I'm concerned, it is the golem sometimes for me. So it is a stupid content tracker, and that language, I feel, sort of is a leftover that no longer represents the community of its users. So part of what I try to do in my workshops is to take out the stupid from Git and to reclaim that word Git even, and to make it into something more accessible and friendly. And it's something that is difficult because as programmers, we're so used to this kind of easy hello world. There's sort of that 10-line thing that you should be able to drop into any programming language, and you generate the words hello world on a screen. And there's not an equivalent to a hello world experience in Git, in part because if we're using Git in a workshop scenario outside of the context of our real work, then it's not real. It's very much fake. We can't really learn how we're going to be using it until we have our own work in there. And once we have our own work in there, it feels like the stakes are very, very high. So most of the workshops, and certainly this is how I used to teach version control. If you were to go back to 2009, my OSCON deck for Bazaar would have been pretty much exactly this. You initialize a directory. It'll be really easy. You add some files. Ta-da, you're doing version control. But what I've come to find is that it's not exactly the most useful way to present the information. It ends up generating more questions than answers. So what I have done is gone back to my teaching roots. I'm not a trained educator, other than sort of what Wikipedia has taught me and what the classroom has taught me. But I went back to education theory and started looking at, well, why is it that this hello world example that we typically use for teaching Git, why is it so ineffective? And Bloom's taxonomy, which was developed in some year, probably this century, I'm sorry, I'm not very good with dates, basically gives us this pyramid of learning. And at the bottom, we have sort of the fundamental skills that we need to learn. And they have words like remembering, understanding, applying. And if I take a look at my cheat sheet here, you need to be able to recall information, memorize things, define, duplicate, explain ideas or concepts, recognize, paraphrase, describe. All of these are sort of considered the base of the pyramid. We need to learn the commands before we can get to the higher level pieces, the knowledge work. And this is where we start creating and inventing and analyzing and evaluating. But this pyramid doesn't really work for the adult learner. If we sit people down and we say, memorize these 10 commands at the remember level, and then you'll learn version control, it will be fine, I find that it's not really all that effective when people get back to their actual workplace and they need to apply those commands. One of the big reasons, so we go a little bit further now in learning theory, and we see that Knowles has come up with 6 tenets of adult education. And these 6 tenets are basically saying that the adult learner is selfish. And in a really positive way, though, because the adult learner wants information that is directly related to their experience. They're not interested in having 10 commands that they need to memorize. They're not interested in the alphabetical listing of Git help. What they want to know is, how does this apply to me? Why do I need to learn it? What is this going to do when I get back to my workplace? And by giving them the simple hello world example, we're not meeting the learner's needs as an adult learner. Now, this is kind of cheating as well, because it's not really adults versus kids. So Knowles talked about andragogy as opposed to pedagogy, so an adult learner as opposed to a child learner. But really what we're looking at is the constructivist theory of knowledge creation. So if you go and look at Piaget, Papert, and Montessori, you can see that learning should be about building on what you already know. So that straight memorization piece, perhaps as a child you need to memorize words, but then as you gradually gain skill, you're always building on something that was previously there. And by sitting someone down in front of Git and saying, here are the 10 commands you need to memorize, you're not giving the learner the opportunity to hook into prior knowledge. So it's not really an adult versus child thing, but more this constructivist piece. So if we change that diagram a little bit, and we say, and these are all just pictures that I've pulled off the internet, perhaps obviously, and we say, if we take the pyramid shape away, and we instead look at how we can think of these skills as a collection that we need to tap into, instead of a hierarchy where we start at the bottom and work up. And then this one is probably my favorite one. This one has those same pyramid skills in the middle. The middle ring is the sort of the verbs that go along with, and then the outside ring is how you can test for those skills. So writing a report, self-evaluation. Adults totally into self-evaluation. They want to know that what they're doing is right. They need to know that they need to have themselves validated as a learner. They can't just sort of tinker with things and be content without that feedback mechanism. So these are all things that are of deep interest to me, and probably most of you at this point are, yeah, not really sure why I'm talking about this at a Git conference, but it was kind of interesting, so thanks. Yeah, can we get back to Git now? Yep, sure, okay. So what I've sort of taken from all of this information is how can I reshape the Git workshop, the Git presentation that I've been giving, and indeed the greater version control presentation that I've been giving for over a decade now. And certainly the first thing that sort of comes to mind for me is that the only person who's ever wanted me to memorize Git commands is a workshop instructor. So the clients don't care. My coworkers probably, well, we'll get to that in a minute, actually, because yeah. So what I've come to do with these workshops, and I'll run you through my slide deck from a workshop in a few minutes, is that we start with whole ideas and we solve real problems. So the first bit of these workshops is very non-traditional. I have people, the workshop description is, bring your notebook and pencil. You can use a digital thing if you want, just as long as you don't spend all of your time choosing the perfect color for rage. And I sort of have fun with it. But basically what I tell people is that most of your problems are social problems when it comes to Git. How are you going to actually work with your team? Now, I use a specific percentage on this, 90%, because what I've found in Git workshops is that people like to argue, perhaps a little bit, about which commands should be used at what point. So this is kind of a smoke and mirrors, because what I've done is I've given you an arbitrary number that you can argue about later and distract those folks from actually the Git process that we're going to be learning in the workshop. So I do have a bit of fun with it. I also tend to avoid any kind of software-specific implementations. So I don't teach I don't teach any one piece of software. I'm instead teaching, and I was going to try and read through all the different ones that I've got screenshotted, and then I thought better of it. I personally am very command line focused. I don't trust GUIs as a programmer. I know what goes into them. Not that the command line isn't its own interface, but in any case. So the first thing that I have people do is I think about what are the commands that you're going to be using in the context of your work. And we essentially throw out the checklist of commands to learn, and instead start looking at who are the people in your team. And this is an activity that I have folks do. I give them sort of a minute or two. People are always very confused why I'm having them do this. But I have the folks in the workshop actually write down the names of the people on their code team. And for the most part, code teams are relatively small. They may get as high as 20. Obviously, in much bigger projects, you would not be listing all thousands of developers. But on Scrum teams, most of the people at the workshops I'm at are on relatively small teams. So they write down the names. That's the first list. And again, people just give me these really weird looks. And then I get them to talk about the tasks that are being performed by each of these people. And the tasks could be things like writing code, reviewing code, fixing broken code, but like whatever it is that you need to do. And again, people start to ask questions about, well, when you say review code, do you mean the QA team or do you mean the peer review team? Because we don't really do peer review at all and this is when you start to uncover how broken so many organizations are. Because often what's happening is their QA team has a very specific way that they want things done. They don't want to move to Git because they like having locked branches in Subversion, and they want their quality assurance team to still be able to do this, and they've been sent to the workshop to be able to prove that Git can still do, and it's like mostly political, right? Git doesn't care how you actually go through this workflow. But you start to uncover some of the problems that they're going to face in adopting Git in their team. So I get them to write down all of these things. We start sort of coming up with this really, more and more complex list of problems that they're going to have to deal with. Then we start talking about tools and restraints or constraints. Where is your code hosted? What are the servers that you push to? Do you have a staging instance? Oh, you don't have local development. How interesting. Perhaps this is something you might want to explore. And again, we sort of build this list out of how they're going to work. And it's a trick. Because what they're doing at this point is they're developing the checklist for what they need to create amazing documentation, to create a workflow that they can then use with Git. And it's a very weird approach for a lot of people because they're expecting to have hands-on code, they're expecting to be typing things, and so some people do sort of get a little bit frustrated at the pace of this initial workshop. But we get to the point where they can sketch things out. And I give them a few minutes and then perhaps give them a sample diagram. I like to give broken diagrams or incomplete diagrams so that people can fix them, because that process of fixing the diagram helps people to understand what their own workflow is and how something actually works. So I will often, as part of my workshop presentation, say, I've really been struggling on how to present this idea. So if you've got suggestions on like how I might fix this slide in future I've been using that same slide for 5 years, and I've been using that line for the last 5 years. I'm not going to fix it. But what I want the audience to do, what I want the learners to do, is think about how they would reshape that information. This gives them a sense of ownership over the information, and it forces them to do that critical analysis of what they're looking at. Far more powerful than simply asking someone to run git init at the command line. So then, depending on the amount of time, I'll also have people go around and look at one another's diagrams and provide comments and feedback. And at this point, one of two things will happen. The room will look at me with vague amounts of disgust that they're having to speak with other folks. This is not what they do at workshops. But this is sort of, again, pulling on sort of past educators. This is going to Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is saying the audience knows more about what they need to learn, and the person doing the speaking is the person doing the learning. So by giving the audience the opportunity to speak with one another and to, whether it's commiserated how horrible the workshop is or commiserated how horrible their workplace is, now they're starting to generate even more context and more answers and more questions for themselves about how to adopt Git. Finally, we have people sketch out their branch management strategy. This is where it gets really hairy, because now I start saying things like git flow and having them map that information onto the diagram. So we start color coding things depending on how enthusiastic. I love shopping for office supplies. This is a normal thing, I'm sure. But getting crayons for adults is one of my favorite things to do, so I'll get them to color code their diagrams. But at the beginning, this diagram wouldn't have made any sense. But taking that sort of one step at a time approach to building information, we're able to get people to the point where they can sketch out sort of not a network diagram, but essentially where all the things exist. What does it mean to have a remote repository? What does it mean to have a local repository? Who's responsible? Well, it's when Jimmy uploads the code over here and Sally uploads her code over there, and then they all come to this central hiding place called the magical GitHub or the magical Bitbucket or the magical whatever it happens to be. They've built this information themselves, so I don't need to explain it because it's in the context that they are most familiar with. The diagram has their names on it. One of the other things that I like to do is essentially to co-create resources, and this is I'm still blown away by this. So I'm writing a book right now. I've been writing a book about Git for a while now. My publisher is very tolerant of my inability to produce to deadline. But it turns out that Git is really hard to explain in a linear fashion. For those of you who grew up in the 80s, if you remember the Choose Your Own Adventure books, they may still exist. You get to page 87, and you have to choose kill off Timmy or go to the well, or what, I don't know, I'm making up weird analogies now. But you then flip to the page where it's relevant. Well, it turns out O'Reilly's not really interested in that style of book. So you need to write things in a different way. And I was trying to figure out how do I explain undoing work in Git in a linear fashion, because it's not linear at all. And I've spent a fair amount of time trolling or trawling the internet for resources, and someone else had done a funny version of a workflow diagram, but there was basically no one was doing this. And I was like, well, I'll just kind of make something up in Balsamic. It'll take me a little bit of time, but it'll be worth it. This now has like 1,500 retweets on Twitter, which it kind of blows my mind, because it's all documentation we've read before, but it's not something that we generally do with this information. We don't generally take it out of the linear format. We don't usually figure out different ways to show how we interact with Git. And so that's part of what I've really enjoyed working on. I would love to get translations of this diagram, mostly because I wasn't expecting it to be this popular. I just was something that I was checking out as sort of a byproduct of writing the book. But it turns out it's really useful. People are printing it, they're putting it up in their offices, they're using it in ways that I hadn't anticipated. If you are interested in contributing a translation, please let me know, or the link is on the final slide. So what are the resources that you can create? How can you, with your teams, have that conversation with them and figure out, perhaps the linear documentation is absolutely meeting the team's needs, but perhaps there's more resources that you can generate as a team to answer some of the questions and ensure that the way you're teaching or onboarding, I guess is the right way to phrase that in a workplace, how you're onboarding people can be easier and faster to pick up. So I have got a few recommendations based on my decade of experience. It's taken me a while to get to this point. It works for me. I am charming on stage, and so I can get away with a lot of these activities. I can confidently stare at an audience and say, no, you will write down this list of things and you will enjoy it because it will make sense later on. That may not be your style, though. So you may find that there are pieces of this that they don't resonate with you at all, and you can't imagine doing things this way. But what I do recommend is figure out how to put the learner first. have the learners build their knowledge by applying their own information, their own context to the experience or the diagrams that you're presenting from the front of the room. Once you know the learner's context, teach relevant workflows. This is virtually impossible in a public workshop with 200 people. But if you're doing consulting or you're just working with your own team, it's very easy to have those conversations to get the context of what they're hoping to do. Co-create visual maps and documentation to help the learner build their own understanding of Git. And finally, teach people to talk one another about their workflows. I find that very often the discussion around version control has almost fear or shame associated with it. People are embarrassed to get things wrong, and especially because it's very difficult. With code, I can give you the gist for my code. I can show you just the snippet. I can share my repository. But it's very difficult to show you the actions of what I've completed in Git. It's very difficult to demonstrate that without sitting down and speaking with someone. And so I find that learners have become very fearful of being exposed as not knowing how to do things. So teach people how to talk about things. Teach people how to have those conversations. One of the, I'll come back to the anti-patterns in a second. One of the ways that I became most interested in actually going from being frustrated with my Git experience to helping other people with it was, this is a bar in Prague that is just off the side of a graveyard. I'm not entirely sure how we found it. This is my friend Karl, and he's delightful. He's teaching me all the things he learned about Git while he was digging into Drupal's code history. He basically did a bunch of forensic stuff on why our theming system exists the way it does. And he was so excited. Oh, it was amazing. And then he showed me a Kaleidoscope app for doing, it's a merge tool. Oh, amazing, I love it. And I had this really positive experience, but it didn't start with the software. It started with me being frustrated and Karl wanting to show me what he had discovered and why he was excited about his findings. The unfortunate thing is that it's kind of expensive to go to Prague and bring Karl with you. It doesn't scale very well. The bar only seats about 20 people, although they do play some great Barry White. So you need to figure out how to have those conversations. So now let's come back and look at some of the anti-patterns for teaching Git. And I hear these, I hate to say all the time, it's easy, it's just a directed acyclic graph. If I hear that one more time, I may have to punch something because it's not easy. It's easy once you know how. And we have this horrible tendency as anyone who's come through the learning process to forget how difficult it was on the other side. And we accidentally create cabals of sort of insider knowledge of how these things happen, and we forget that the folks on the other side of this chasm of information aren't there yet. And so we use language which ultimately makes the learner more isolated and more afraid to reach out and ask for help. So my anti-patterns are all about perhaps having empathy and sitting down and saying, I remember how confusing it was to learn this piece. How are you doing with this? Can you tell me about this thing you did that was horrible, and let me see if I can help you with it. I know it's frustrating, but let's see if we can sit down together. And the other thing that I found, so in the bar, Karl and I sat on the same side of the table and we looked at the same laptop. That's not a traditional workshop experience. A traditional workshop experience, I'm up here, you're down there, I have the stage, and it's very almost confrontational because we're at each other in terms of looking at one another. Figure out how to sit down next to people. So my final sort of recommendations for Git, the software, and this is my guess I'm in the right room to say this, not really sure how it's going to go down though. I don't really know how to access the Git community. I know how to access the golems who are frustrated. And so I'm hoping that after this presentation, people will swarm me and say, come help us with documentation. It will be amazing. We will love you. But that may not happen, and that's OK. But I am hoping that there are ways that we can reduce the barrier to entry for people who are at the very tips of where they need to be when it comes to learning Git, and bring them into the community and encourage people to love what they're doing. You can get in touch with me on Twitter. I do, the second username is my GitHub username. Git for Teams, if you just throw an Emma on there, you can email me as well. I would love to hear from you, and I will try and be brave and speak with all of you here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma.
Thanks.